Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Woodman, and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to talk about your right to espouse thoughts people hate. Before we get into the details, I want to make it clear that I do not support hateful rhetoric, but since we will go over a Supreme Court case that allows people to say offensive and hateful phrases in nonviolent ways, this video serves to educate you about the context behind this, just like all the rest of my educational videos. Let's begin with some background information. In 1955, the Westboro Baptist Church was founded by Fred Phelps. Phelps made his living as a successful civil rights lawyer in Topeka, Kansas, representing African Americans in discrimination lawsuits until he was disbarred for unethical behavior in 1979. In the 1990s, Westboro started in on its anti-gay crusade and gained attention for protesting against homosexuality at the funerals of people who had died of AIDS. Picketing at the funeral of Matthew Shepard, the 21-year-old gay college student who was beaten to death in Laramie, Wyoming, garnered the church national exposure. The messages on their signs show the world what would become the church's recognizably signature combination of hate and appalling personal attacks. In 2001, Phelps attested that 9/11 was God's punishment for Americans' acceptance of homosexuality. In 2005, Westboro started picketing at the funerals of armed forces personnel killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Phelps' convoluted rationale for this new outrage was that God wanted those trapped dead as a sign to warn Americans of the error of their ways. The Westboro Baptist Church picketed at hundreds of funerals and almost certainly added to the trauma experienced by the grieving families at one of the most vulnerable and painful times in their lives. Of all the people impacted, the father of one of those veterans decided to take action. His fight would lead him on a 5-year journey attempting to change the path of hate speech and First Amendment law. Let's talk more about this. Matthew Snyder was a senior in high school when he told his father, Albert, that he wanted to join the military. Albert said he would support his son's choice, but asked Matt to take, quote, a couple of weeks to really think about this, unquote, since the war in Iraq was, quote, not getting any better, unquote. Matt decided to join the Marines, and in 2005, during a Christmas visit home, he told his family he was being deployed to Iraq. On March 3rd, 2006, after being in Iraq for only a few weeks, Matt was on a mission in Al-Anbar province when he was killed in the line of duty. He was only 20 years old. A week later, the funeral for Lance Corporal Matthew Snyder was held at their family's Catholic church, St. John's in Westminster, Maryland. Albert was deeply moved to see thousands of people on the streets paying tribute to Matt. Albert noticed that their driver took the service entrance to bring them around the church. At the time, Albert didn't know why they had gone that way, but the reason soon became clear. Fred Phelps, along with 2 of his daughters and 4 of his grandchildren, had flown in from Kansas to picket Snyder's funeral. Following police instructions, they were standing behind orange snow fencing about 1,000 feet away from the church. Albert Snyder could only see the tops of the signs, but not what they said from the limo. Shortly after the funeral services began in the church, the Phelps family packed up their signs and left. At the wake later that day, the family turned on the television, and that is when Albert first saw the signs. What the church did not know is that although Matt was heterosexual, Albert is gay. His family, or his friends and family knew, but his sexual orientation was otherwise a private matter. Many years later, Albert remembered how his loved ones, quote, hated to see me and my partner and my friends have to deal with something so vicious at a funeral, unquote, adding sorrowfully, quote, I had one opportunity to bury my son and it was taken away from me. He should have had a peaceful burial, unquote. Albert Snyder decided to sue Phelps and the Westboro Baptist Church in federal court for intentional infliction of emotional distress and other claims. Let's talk more about this lawsuit. After a 10-day trial, the jury found in favor of Snyder and awarded him $2.9 million in compensatory damages and $8 million in punitive damages. Although the loss appeared devastating, Phelps' church posted a video in which members enthusiastically said that they, quote, thank God for the $10.9 million verdict because it's a small price to pay to get this message, America is doomed, in front of the eyes of the world. You can't pay for worldwide publicity. That's cheap, unquote. Still, Fred Phelps' daughter, Margie, who, like her father, was a lawyer, filed their appeal and was confident God, quote, would turn our apparent defeat into a victory, unquote. On appeal, the Fourth Circuit Court held that the First Amendment fully protected Westboro's speech as involving matters of public concern as opposed to private matters, which are afforded less First Amendment protections. Judge Robert B. King wrote, quote, it is a fair summary of history to say that the safeguards of liberty have often been forged in controversies involving not very nice people, unquote. The Fourth Circuit Court's ruling was a nearly fatal blow to Albert Snyder's quest for justice. He had only one remaining chance to try to achieve his goal of holding the Westboro Baptist Church accountable for their actions. He appealed to the Supreme Court, and they agreed to hear the appeal in a case called Snyder versus Phelps. Let's go over this case. As the oral arguments drew near, the political impact of the case beyond just a father's fight became clearer. 48 states and a bipartisan coalition of 43 senators filed briefs supporting Snyder. The Attorney General's brief advocated that this uniquely intrusive and harassing speech that amounted to emotional terrorism could and should be restricted without running afoul of the First Amendment. On the opposite side, news and civil liberties organizations lined up to provide briefs stressing that the media and college campuses would both feel the chill if the Fourth Circuit Court's decision was not upheld. A New York Times editorial urged that it was in the nation's interest to ensure, quote, that strong language about large issues be protected even when it is hard to do so, unquote. Outside the Supreme Court on October 6, 2010, the Westboro Baptist Church had once again turned a solemn proceeding into a circus. The church had chosen to picket outside the building where one of their own faithful members, Margie Phelps, was about to argue inside. Inside, the limits of hateful speech were about to be debated in a much less humorous manner. Albert Snyder, his partner Walt Fisher, and Al's daughters and sisters were seated near members of the church. Sean Summers, a Maryland attorney who had been representing Snyder pro bono, started off with this point. Quote, we are talking about a funeral. If context is ever going to matter, it has to matter in the context of a funeral. Mr. Snyder simply wanted to bury his son in a private, dignified manner. Westboro Baptist Church's behavior made that impossible, unquote. As a result, according to Summers, Snyder should be allowed to bring an intentional infliction of emotional distress claim without it being blocked by the First Amendment. After those few sentences, Summers was on the defensive for the rest of his argument. Summers tried to argue that the First Amendment's limits on intentional emotional distress claims that prohibited recovery in Hustler v. Falwell did not apply in this case. He distinguished Hustler based on the fact that Reverend Falwell was a public figure, and here, Snyder was a private figure. Summers said the parody in Hustler was a, quote, traditional area of public discourse, unquote, as opposed to a private funeral. This seemed to do little to alleviate Kagan's concerns about the dangers inherent in giving juries free rein to punish unpopular speech about matters of public interest. Most of the other justices show they were also very concerned about how to draw a line that would allow Snyder to recover without leading to a chilling impact on too much other speech. Summers seemed unable to provide any substantive First Amendment framework that would accommodate Snyder. For Margie Phelps, she was in for an equally rough time before the justices and only got one sentence before she was interrupted with a series of hypotheticals. Justice Samuel Alito Jr. said, quote, suppose someone believes that African Americans are inherently inferior and they are really a bad influence on this country. And so that person comes up to an African American and starts berating that person with racial hatred. That's a matter of public concern, unquote. Phelps replied that she thought, quote, the issue of race is a matter of public concern, unquote, but she also thought, quote, approaching an individual up close and in their grill to berate them gets you out of the zone of protection, and we would never do that, unquote. With much of the discussion centering on what could be said, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg zeroed in on the issue of where the picketing should be allowed to occur. She said, quote, this is a case about exploiting a private family's grief, and the question is, why should the First Amendment tolerate exploiting this Marine's family when you have so many other forms of getting across your message, unquote. Phelps got hung up objecting to the term exploiting. It was indicative of her performance throughout, technically respectful, but intransigent in her repeated refusal to directly answer many of the questions. Either way, both Summers and Phelps appear to have done little to advance their causes. Despite the justices' apparent struggle at oral argument with the facts and devising limits of both sides, for both sides, the vote was nearly unanimous. The Westboro Baptist Church had prevailed 8-1 with only Justice Alito dissenting. The majority ruled that the First Amendment protected the church from liability for their speech on a matter of public concern in a public place, which did not actually disrupt or physically interfere with a funeral. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote, quote, whether the First Amendment prohibits holding Westboro liable for its speech in this case turns largely on whether that speech is of public or private concern, as determined by all the circumstances of the case. The First Amendment reflects a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open because speech concerning public affairs is more than self-expression. It is the essence of self-government. Accordingly, speech on public issues occupies the highest rung of the hierarchy of First Amendment values and is entitled to special protection, unquote. The somewhat vague guidance he then offered is, quote, speech deals with matters of public concern when it could be fairly considered as relating to any matter of public, social, or other concern to the community, or when it is a subject of legitimate news interest, unquote. Adding that the, quote, inappropriate or controversial character of a statement is irrelevant, unquote. To determine whether Westboro's speech was, quote, of public or private concern, unquote, Chief Justice Roberts examined its content and context. While these messages may fall short of refined social or political commentary, the issues they highlight, the political and moral conduct of the United States and its citizens, the fate of our nation, homosexuality in the military, and scandals involving the Catholic clergy, are matters of public importance. Roberts disposed of the idea that having personal messages thrown into the speech mix might potentially tip the balance between speech of a public nature to speech concerning private matters. Even if a few of the signs, such as, quote, you're going to hell, unquote, and, quote, God hates you, unquote, were viewed as containing messages relating to Matthew Snyder or the Snyders specifically, that would not change the fact that the overall thrust and dominant theme of Westboro's demonstration spoke to broader public issues. The key then is whether the dominant theme or main point of the speech is about a matter of public concern. This way, the majority cuts off the problems of courts having to read every sign at a protest to determine if any, might enable punishment of the speakers. Reviewing the context of Westboro's speech, Chief Justice Roberts arrived at the funeral issue. The fact that Westboro was picketing on a public street meant that despite being near the funeral, it had located itself squarely in a quintessential public forum, where making space for free speech is traditionally most protected by the court. The Chief Justice recognized that even in such a public forum, the state can still impose, quote, reasonable time, place, or manner restrictions, unquote, on expressive activity, as long as the laws are content neutral, meaning a law that applies the same to all speech, no matter what the subject matter or content of the speech may be. In this circumstance, however, the damages were imposed entirely because of the content of the message expressed. For the majority, this was a fatal flaw at the heart of the case. The Chief Justice reminded us that Westboro's, quote, speech cannot be restricted simply because it is upsetting or arouses contempt, unquote. He wrote, quote, "If there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. Instead, the point of all speech protection is to shield just those choices of content that in someone's eyes are misguided or even hurtful. Westboro's funeral picketing is certainly hurtful and it contributes to public discourse, may be negligible, but Westboro addressed matters of public importance on public property in a peaceful manner, in full compliance with the guidance of local officials. The speech was indeed planned to coincide with Matthew Snyder's funeral, but did not itself disrupt that funeral. And Westboro's choice to conduct its picketing at that time and place did not alter the nature of its speech. Speech is powerful. It can stir people to action, move them to tears of both joy and sorrow, and, as it did here, inflict great pain. On the facts before us, we cannot react to that pain by punishing the speaker. As a nation, we have chosen a different course to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure that we do not stifle public debate," unquote. In these lines, Chief Justice Roberts, a self-described aggressive defender of the First Amendment, strongly reaffirmed a few fundamental tenets of the Supreme Court's established view of free speech and its role in our society. Robust debate on public issues is a central part of the American experience. Protecting hateful speech is necessary to maintain free debate. Therefore, as a trade-off for the greater good, some will suffer great pain from the speech of others. With this majority opinion in mind, let's look at Justice Alito's dissenting opinion, where he put forth a very different interpretation of what the First Amendment requires. He said, quote, "Our profound national commitment to free and open debate is not a license for the vicious verbal assault that occurred in this case. Albert Snyder is not a public figure. He is simply a parent who wanted what is surely the right of any parent who experiences such an incalculable loss to bury his son in peace. But members of the Westboro Baptist Church deprived him of that elementary right," unquote. Alito then challenged the majority on 2 points underlining their decision. First, he described why, in his view, the church went, quote, "far beyond the commentary on matters of public concern," unquote, and in fact had, quote, "specifically attacked Matthew Snyder because, 1, he was a Catholic, and 2, he was a member of the United States military," unquote. In his opinion, this, quote, attack on Matthew was of central importance, unquote, to Westboro's speech. And Alito contended that even if you were to accept the majority's findings that the, quote, overall thrust and dominant theme of their demonstration spoke to broad public issues, unquote, he did not agree that, quote, actionable speech should be immunized simply because it is interspersed with speech that is protected, unquote. Second, Justice Alito criticized the majority for overvaluing the fact that the picketing occurring on a public street. He said, quote, "There is no reason why a public street in close proximity to the scent of a funeral should be regarded as a free fire zone in which otherwise accountable verbal attacks are shielded from liability," unquote. In an endnote to the majority opinion, Justice Roberts addressed this line of the dissent. Quote, "The fact that Westboro conducted its picketing adjacent to a public street does not insulate the speech from liability, but instead heightens concerns that what is at issue is an effort to communicate to the public the church's views on matters of public concern," unquote. Alito finished by focusing on the brutality of speech and the feelings of the grieving family members. Quote, "In order to have a society in which public issues can be openly and vigorously debated," unquote, he insisted, quote, "it is not necessary to allow the brutalization of innocent victims," unquote. With this blistering last line, Justice Alito rejected the majority's conception that for free speech to flourish, hateful speech must be allowed to exist. So, hate speech about matters of public concern in public places is entitled to full First Amendment protection. Just as with the Jehovah's Witnesses in Barnett, civil rights activists in Sullivan, Vietnam War protesters in Tinker and Cohen, and the person in Hustler, the Supreme Court has resolved that controversial and objectionable speech should be safeguarded despite how much people may object to the content of that speech. At the same time, it is also important to recognize that the protection of hate speech as a matter of free speech law in no way obligates us as a society to accept the messages of hate or to turn a blind eye to the harm that such words can cause. In addition, the Snyder case also reminds us that the government can impose time, place, and manner restrictions on demonstrations for a wide range of content-neutral reasons. For example, a city may constitutionally require protesters on two sides of an issue be separated for public safety, as long as neither side is privileged or disadvantaged because of their viewpoints, require the submission of pre-match plans, and set boundaries on the use of public property. And of course, violence of any kind can be prosecuted without any First Amendment restrictions. This is the state of the law on hate speech today, and given the Supreme Court's relatively recent recommitment to these principles by a broad coalition of liberal and conservative justices, it seems unlikely it will change anytime soon. Nevertheless, given the seemingly resurgence of neo-Nazism in this country, this approach can be disturbing enough to shake the confidence of even the most loyal First Amendment adherents. So, what happened after this decision? We saw one justification for free speech, including hate speech, the ability of raucous debate to change people's minds, play out in very unexpected ways. Megan Phelps Roper, granddaughter of Westboro founder Fred Phelps, responded to the news of their Supreme Court victory by using social media to triumphantly proclaim their church's joy. Megan had become her church's social media spokesperson, saying, quote, "The Lord has given us a new platform," unquote. She described using, quote, Twitter to bait celebrities with anti-gay messages to publicly celebrate Japan's Fukushima nuclear disaster and to debate the merits of the Snyder case with anyone who would listen, unquote. And then discussions she had with people on Twitter or X actually led her to begin questioning her faith. One turning point came when an Israeli Jewish blogger used New Testament quotations to dispute Westboro's belief in the death penalty for gay people. Megan began to consider, quote, if the church was wrong, unquote, about these issues, quote, what else were we wrong about, unquote. As Megan put it, there were, quote, these individuals who found ways of effectively challenging her beliefs at Westboro, unquote. Her hate speech had brought her in touch with counter speech. Eventually, in 2012, at the age of 26, she walked out and left the Westboro Baptist Church and their hateful beliefs behind for good. Now, Megan uses her story to show that it is possible to break through the walls of our increasingly polarized society in which we frequently demonize the other side. She said, quote, the good news is that it's simple and the bad news is that it's hard. We have to talk and listen to people we disagree with, unquote. From her personal experience, she sees the growing popularity of the idea that, quote, refusing to grant mainstream platforms to hated ideas will halt their spread as a fundamentally flawed strategy, one that ignores the practicalities of human nature. The principles enshrined in the First Amendment are no less relevant to social media than they are in public spaces, that open discourse and dialect is the most effective enabler of the evolution of individuals and societies, unquote. Megan's transformation mirrors the change of heart experienced by Albert Snyder. After the ruling, which came the day before the 5th anniversary of Matthew's death, Snyder spoke out at a press conference. Quote, we found out today that we can no longer bury our dead with dignity. I'm just very disappointed in America today, unquote. Over time, Albert's feelings toward the Supreme Court and free speech evolved. By 2019, in an interview on the legal podcast Unprecedented, Albert expressed different feelings about the Supreme Court and free speech. Snyder said, quote, my son fought and died for freedom of speech, and I do understand what they did, and I may not have when the decision came down. I remember being very upset, but reality sat in, and I started to reflect on everything. And I realized that the Supreme Court made the right decision, as painful as it was, unquote. With that simple statement of acceptance, two First Amendment figures had come to a profound agreement about the meaning of free speech in America. Now, let's look at a modern example of the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. In the darkness of night, there were a bunch of people carrying tiki torches and shouting these angry chants, quote, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Blood and soil. White lives matter," unquote. More than 300 white nationalists were marching in an unaccounted way on the campus of the University of Virginia. They were just some of the self-identified neo-Nazi Ku Klux Klan or KKK members and other alt-right adherents who had come to Charlottesville for a Unite the Right rally scheduled to take place the next day. The rally had been organized by Jason Kessler, a local resident and University of Virginia graduate who described himself as a white advocate. On his permit application, Kessler described the event as a free speech rally for an estimated 400 participants at Emancipation Park. The initial purpose for the rally was to oppose the city council's efforts to remove a statue of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee from that park, which, until 3 months prior, had been named after Lee. However, in a later interview, Kessler said his goal for Unite the Right was to, quote, destigmatize white advocacy so that white people can stand up for their interests just like any other identity group, unquote. 5 days before the rally, city officials informed Kessler that they would only grant a permit to hold the event at a larger park based on the information that, quote, many thousands of individuals are likely to attend the demonstration, unquote, and that officials, quote, cannot adequately protect people and property in and around Emancipation Park, unquote. The Virginia ACLU took up Kessler's case, arguing that the city's reasons for denying the permit at the part of Kessler's choice were only a, quote, pretext for silencing the Unite the Right demonstration, unquote. The judge ruled for Kessler, having determined that quote, the decision to revoke Kessler's permit was based on the content of his speech rather than other neutral factors, unquote. On the morning of August 12, 2017, the largest gathering of white nationalists in decades was heading towards an Emancipation Park. Violence soon broke out between the alt-right and counter-protesters as police stood by, unable or unwilling to do anything to stop it. As the fighting grew more intense, about a half an hour before the rally was officially set to begin at noon, the Charlottesville police chief declared the event an, quote, unlawful assembly, unquote. The police ordered the crowd to disperse and announced that there would be no rally. Alt-right forces began to leave the park, but many continued to spew hate at the counter-protesters. The unintended result of the police action was that the fighting spread beyond the park as, quote, small groups of people wandered through the streets and engaged in frequent skirmishes unimpeded by police, unquote. President Trump responded to this event, quote, "We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on both sides," unquote, adding again for emphasis with a wave of his hand, quote, "on many sides," unquote. Equating neo-Nazis, the KKK, and white supremacists with those protesting racism triggered a widespread outcry, even from prominent members of his own party. And so under pressure, Trump reluctantly offered an actual condemnation of racism and hate groups. But another day later, he doubled down on his previous remarks, insisting, quote, "You had some very bad people in that group, but also had people that were very fine people on both sides," unquote. Charlottesville Mayor Mike Singer responded, quote, "I'm not going to make any bones about it. I place the blame for a lot of what you're seeing in America today right at the doorstep of the White House and the people around the president," unquote. Whatever may have caused or exacerbated this hate, the tragedy of Charlottesville and Trump's response had certainly highlighted the forces of white nationalism that still exist in this country. But why do I bring up this example? Clearly, physical violence occurred here, and we know that legal action can be taken against people who commit physical violence. But let's say the physical violence did not occur, and all that happened was the white nationalists just saying their phrases. Let's also say they actually followed the permits granted to them and make it a lawful assembly. Despite the hateful and offensive rhetoric at this rally, the Snyder versus Phelps case protects this kind of rally because it still counts as free speech. This Unite the Right rally saw the potential takedown of Confederate statutes and later on to improve white advocacy as public concerns, and they wanted to protest in the park, which is a public place. We also know the permits could not have been denied simply based on the content of the speech, being given. Again, this was said before things got chaotic. Once things got chaotic, then the free speech rights changed here. To be clear, I do not personally support hateful rallies, but the point of going over this example is to help you understand why hateful rallies are allowed as long as they are peaceful, address public concerns that occur in a public place. It is because the Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment protects vicious and hurtful speech when it concerns public issues such as the nation's moral and political conduct. Before I researched the Supreme Court case, I have wondered why hateful rallies are allowed to exist and why the First Amendment protects hate speech. Now I know more information behind this part of the First Amendment protection. Whether you see a hateful rally as you drive on the road, on TV, or social media, you now know why it is allowed to exist. Still, you do not have to engage with the rally goers, and you can keep moving on. If you decide to counter-protest the hateful rallies, make sure you are doing so safely and be ready if things escalate. One more thing to keep in mind is since these hateful rallies are allowed, you can see who participates in these rallies. If you do not tolerate hate, you will know who you should not associate yourself with because you do not want to support their hateful beliefs. Consider it as an opportunity to let them be who they want to be and give yourself the choice on if you want to be around them or not. In the next video, we will go over the right to use social media as a public forum. Until then, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and turn on the post notifications so you will be notified when I post my next video. I appreciate your support. Remember, you are powerful, you are capable, and you are the changemaker our society needs. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you soon.